sad outcome or a negative outcome, such as implantation failure after you are dealing with the IVF or ICSI procedure. So we need to be proactive. We need to find the causes. We need to see for the solutions of this topic today, which we are going to discuss, is recurrent implantation failure. So implantation, as we all know, is the attachment and subsequent penetration by a zona-free blastocyst into the endometrium. Implantation failure, who have never shown quantifiable signs of implantation, such as increased levels of beta SCG, or if they have shown raised SCG, then there was a no gestational sac which was seen later on. So how will you define recurrent IVF failure? So we are not going to have a routine lecture today. We'll be having a discussion and answering some common questions. So RIF versus recurrent IVF failure. RIF is not exactly as same as recurrent IVF failure. Recurrent IVF failure is the failure to achieve a pregnancy after several IVF attempts. A common cause being poor response to ovarian stimulation. The term recurrent implantation failure is a subgroup of this recurrent IVF failure and should not be used to replace it. Recurrent implantation can be defined in different manners. We'll see what are the common definition and what are the fallacies of each of these are. So implantation failure after transfer of 3 high quality embryos or with a transfer of more than 10 embryos in multiple transfers with exact numbers determined by each center. That was the definition given by ESHRE PGD Consortium way back in 2005. We haven't had got a newer definition from ESHRE after that. However, this definition looks a little bit tricky in the era of elective single embryo transfer. A recent or newer definition is come up from Coghlan in 2014, which includes the embryo quality and the maternal age. So embryo, it should be a good quality embryo. Number transfer should be 4 or more. The stage of development was also defined in this, that is the blastocyst stage, and the storage protocol, which includes both fresh and frozen, with at least 3 cycles of embryo transfer. Maternal age less than 40 is also the criteria for this definition. So this is a little bit comprehensive definition of recurrent implantation failure. However, there are no studies subsequent to this 2014 Coghlan article taking into consideration this definition. So we are not yet to get the exact incidence and prevalence of recurrent implantation failure. So what are the, we'll just briefly discuss the theory part of this, and then we'll go to some cases and case discussions and treatment part of this. So what are the causes of recurrent implantation failure and how do we classify these causes? So we have a 3 dimensions for this etiology. We have the embryo endometrial crosstalk. We have the embryo factor, we have the endometrial factor, and we have other factors which will affect the implantation. So in the embryo factors, we have the embryo quality. Embryo quality will itself depend upon the sperm and the oocyte quality. In the endometrial factors, we have thin endometrium and a poorly receptive endometrium, which will encompass this factor. And in other factors, we have what mnemonic is given below is GAPLEII. So genetic factors, anatomical factors. Anatomical factors will be again classified into congenital factors and acquired causes. Congenital will be including subseptate and bicornate uterus, and in acquired causes we'll be having intrauterine causes, uterine causes. So we have polyps and myomas, submucous myomas, and in pelvic causes I've included adenomyosis, endometriosis, and fibroids. In the laboratory causes, the lab standards and different criteria used for embryo selection. Endocrine causes, they include the hypo and hyperthyroidism, diabetes mellitus, hyperprolactinemia, and so on. Infection, most common is the chronic endometritis, which is being discussed these days, and the treatment for it. And immunological causes, which will including the microimmune environment, the autoantibodies, and other systemic immunological disorders. We'll be discussing each of these. So regarding the causes of the embryo, it is related to the gamete and related to the oocyte quality and sperm DNA damage. Also related to paternal and maternal balance translocations, aneuploidies, zona hardening, and inadequate culture. In the maternal factors, we have the endometrial factors, which we have discussed, thin endometrium and non-receptive endometrium or out of phase endometrium. Anatomical causes, we have the congenital and acquired causes. So in the pelvic causes, we have adenomyosis, fibroid, endometriosis, hydrosalpingosis, which might cause this entity of recurrent implantation failure. Endocrine causes, we have thyroid, diabetes. Also included as an endocrine entity nowadays is obesity. In the genetic causes, we have genes responsible for endometriosis and they impair with the endometrial receptivity, and 1/3 of these are associated with NK cell activation. The infections or chronic endometritis form another part of this, and the immunological factors are also included as one of the causes. So we have all these maternal factors which come up, like the congenital uterine anomalies, septate and bicornuate uterus, thin and non-responsive endometrium, acquired uterine malformations. We have the genetic congenital thrombophilias and the acquired thrombophilias. However, these are considered more so of a cause of recurrent pregnancy loss than particularly a cause of recurrent implantation failure, but it sometimes can lead to recurrent implantation failure. That's why it's included. Infections and immunological causes. Decreased endometrial receptivity can either be due to undiagnosed uterine pathology. A study by Demirol and Durgon et al. In 2004 has shown that 18 to 27% of women with failed implantation have shown uterine problems like polyps, hyperplasia, endometritis, and synecdoche as the important cause of implantation failure, which was not detected previously by a routine ultrasonography or a 3D ultrasonography. A decreased receptivity without any pathology can be there in cases of out of phase endometrium. We'll shortly discuss about the risk factors, and each of these can be a causative factor on its own. So maternal age is a very important single variable affecting the outcome of ART, and this can lead to cases of recurrent implantation failure. It plays a crucial role in the quality of embryos used for IVF, and the frequency of aneuploidy is also increasing as the age is advancing. We all know there is a landmark of age that is more than 35 and less than 35. So there was a study by Shapiro et al. In 2016 where 50% of transfers were asynchronous in women with less than 35 years of age, and recurrent implantation failure was found in more than 35 years of age, and that was correlated well with the age. Implantation rate in both fresh and frozen embryo transfers were done, and which were higher rates of failure were observed in women more than 44 years in another study. Regarding body mass index, obese women tend to have fewer oocyte collections in spite of a higher dose of gonadotropins used for stimulation, and this was statistically significant in a study by Predrosk et al. In 2000. And overweight and obese women have higher risks of implantation failure and miscarriage than women of healthy weight with the same number of oocytes. This was a study by Orvieto et al. So the confounding factor was eliminated in this, and obesity independently showed high risk for implantation failure. Regarding smoking, in women undergoing IVF, patients who were smoking had lower levels of estradiol, and the cigarette toxins along with these lower levels led to a disrupting of the corpus luteum, and therefore a defective implantation of the embryo. A study by Whelan et al. In 2009 showed a decreased live birth rate, suggesting that smoking has a lower or negative impact on pregnancy outcome. We all are aware about the impact of alcohol and stress. So there was a nice guideline in 2004 that suggested to reduce alcohol consumption to less than equal to 1 or 2 units in a week, those who are trying to become pregnant. So that is the nice guideline. I won't go into much details about alcohol. Stress, elevated levels of cortisol leads to a 2.7 times higher chance of miscarriage, and IVF failure was associated with higher rates of post-IVF anxiety, and therefore subsequently problem in a subsequent cycle was also anticipated because of this stress. Regarding oocyte quality, so compromised oocyte quality as a cause of RIF is suspected in cases of poor response to ovarian stimulation or a suboptimal response to ovarian stimulation. Low antral follicle counts, high FSH, and low AMH levels were related to recurrent implantation failure, in spite embryo quality being the optimum. Aggressive ovarian stimulation protocols may lead to production of poor oocyte quality sometimes, and this was shown by a study by Warburger et al. In 2009. Sorry. Regarding sperm factors, poor quality spermatozoa, which are associated with oligoastheno and teratospermia, along with azoospermia, are associated with a higher chance of poor embryo development and subsequent implantation failure. DNA damage due to smoking, genital tract infections, previous chemo or radiotherapy. Also, some amount of DNA damage is expected with the presence of varicocele. So the incidence of varicocele was more than 40% in infertile males, and this was associated with oxidative stress and subsequent DNA damage. Parental chromosomal anomalies are also sometimes related with recurrent implantation failure. So we are not doing karyotyping in each and every case, only in those cases where the suspicion is high, where there is history of previous multiple abortions or recurrent pregnancy losses. We may subject the patient to karyotyping, but this can yield some results, can be a positive factor for recurrent implantation failure, including translocations, mosaicisms, inversions, and deletions. Out of these, the translocations form a higher prevalence, and they tend to have a failed IVF cycle than the others. This leads to defective gametogenesis or recurrent spontaneous miscarriages or RPL cases. The other factors in the woman are always there, which we considered about the anatomical factors, the pelvic factors, the infections. Those are mostly self-explanatory, so I'm not going to go into the theoretical aspect of it. But the other things which we need to consider as a theory is the immunological factors and the probable role of therapy which has come up for this treatment. So we have Th1 to Th2 ratio. Elevated levels of natural killer cells, abnormal levels of TNF alpha and interleukin 10 ratio, and autoantibodies which are responsible for RIF. Regarding the levels of natural killer cells, so peripheral and central natural killer cells were studied in many of the studies, and there were conflicting results. So no guideline has come regarding the measurement of NK cells in those patients having RIF. So we have a study from Yamada et al. In 2003, which stated that raised levels of NK cells might not affect only implantation, but may be involved in additional mechanism responsible for a successful pregnancy. And another study by Sachs et al. It said that NK cell measurement did not distinguish a woman with RIF from general population. However, it might be used in women who have a established or a diagnosed case of RIF. So peripheral and uterine NK cells are elevated in cases of RIF, is seen in a study by Sentinel et al. In 2014. Regarding the Th1 to Th2 ratio, as we all know, the Th1 levels are hampering the Th1 to Th2 ratio. The Th2 is a pro-pregnancy state where the high levels of Th2 are associated with pregnancy. And cytokines responsible produced by Th1, such as TNF alpha and TNF alpha, will oppose the cytokines produced by Th2 cells, which are the interleukin 4, interleukin 6, and interleukin 10. So TNF alpha to interleukin 10 ratio, which is raised, can be a guidance for recurrent implantation failure. Regarding the autoantibodies, so we have certain diseases like the which will produce these autoantibodies: anti-nuclear antibodies, anti-cardiolipin antibodies, and anti-phospholipid antibodies. Out of these, the anti-cardiolipin antibodies are well studied, and they can form in the blood will form hindrance for implantation. There is a strong association also between the anti-beta-2 glycoprotein and anti-nuclear antibodies in implantation failure. Stern et al. Proposed that anti-phosphatidyl inositol, anti-phosphatidyl ethanolamine, and anti-phosphatidyl serine, their raised levels are seen in cases of implantation failure. However, in 2008, there was an ASRM committee opinion that there is no statistically significant impact on the presence of anti-phospholipid antibodies in IVF outcome. Regarding hereditary thrombophilias, there was a higher rates of incidence of hereditary thrombophilias associated with RIF in the study by Azam et al. However, this again was not statistically significantly associated with the poor ART outcomes or cases of RIF. Regarding the pathophysiologic mechanisms, so we have a role of certain molecules which will be aiding this implantation process. So hyperglycosylated HCG is produced in first 3 weeks of implantation. It's produced by the cytotrophoblast, and it is thought to assist the embryo invasion into the decidua, and it's a very good marker of implantation. So lower levels of hyperglycosylated HCG have been shown in those who have had biochemical pregnancies with a subsequently negative beta HCG levels in a study by Cole et al. In 2012. Another important factor which we studied with RIF is the leukemia inhibitory factors. So low levels of LIF are associated with higher levels of implantation failure, and LIF and the family of interleukin 6 is one of the factors which is explored with the endometrial receptivity, and these LIF levels have been decreased also with patients with hydrosalpinges. Therefore, we get a good result whenever we are clipping or doing the salpingectomy for hydrosalpinges. Regarding the prostaglandins and cellular adhesion molecules, so we have the phospholipase A2 and the COX2, which are involved in the prostaglandin synthesis. Levels of cytosolic phospholipase A2 and COX2 were found to be decreased in patients with RIF. Regarding cellular adhesion molecules, we all know that CAMs are now considered as those which function in cellular interaction and invasion and implantation of the embryo. So specifically, alpha V beta 3 is being studied, and Thomas et al. In 2000, way back in 2003, showed that the luminal epithelium greater levels of alpha V beta 3 are found in those who have a successful pregnancy than those who have cases of missed abortions or miscarriages. So in short, these are the molecules which are studied in RIF. So we have the hyperglycosylated HCG levels, prostaglandins, leukemia inhibitor factor, and cellular adhesion molecules or CAMs which are being studied. So this is much of a theoretical discussion. We'll now shortly go to the diagnostic tools before we get onto some cases and treatment for those. Ovarian function tests. So assessment of oocyte quality and quantity is very important, and this can be achieved by certain tests like FSH. We have raised FSH level, low and AMH levels. Low AFC levels is seen in patients those who have a poor ovarian response or a suboptimal response. Extreme degree of ovarian reserve can also affect the oocyte quality and also the number of oocytes which are produced after stimulation. So low antral follicle, high FSH and low AMH levels are found as a causative factor in RIF by large study by Kuglan et al. In 2013. Regarding the male factor, we all know that oligoasthenoteratospermia will affect fertility, but those who have normozoospermia, in those patients also we have a male factor as a cause of, we may have a male factor as a cause of recurrent implantation failure, which should not be overlooked. We have sperm chromosomal abnormalities which are being recognized nowadays as a cause of recurrent implantation failure. So more than 28% to 30% of sperm cells exhibit DNA fragmentation, and compared to only 13% of those with fertile males. So we have raised a DFI of more than 30%, which we take as a guidance, and this was a guideline by ASRM also. So routine DFI measurement is not advised, but however, in cases of recurrent implantation failure, this can provide us a hope or maybe a guideline, etiology, etiopathogenesis for these RIF cases. So we have certain tests called as the tunnel assay, the comet assay, the sperm chromatin dispersion, which can be used as tests to detect this DNA fragmentation. And how do we interpret it? We have seen it later on. So pre-implantation genetic testing for aneuploidy and pre-implantation genetic testing for structural rearrangements both can be used as a diagnostic modality for cases with RIF. So as we have seen that balanced translocations are more common in cases parents transmitting to the embryo, and these are more common in cases of RIF. So parental karyotyping is also recommended. However, a routine or a normal parental karyotyping should not be advised to each and every IVF case. This can be a diagnostic modality. Both of these can be a diagnostic modality for RIF cases. So I've summarized the diagnostic tools here for recurrent implantation failure. So we have sperms which have a routine semen analysis. This can be performed again by a good andrologist. We have a DNA fragmentation index. We have seen about it. We have sperm culture. So this can also play a role in implantation failure and infections in the semen. So high resolution ultrasound imaging and MRI. So this imaging again forms an important aspect, which things which may have been overlooked sometimes can be diagnosed by using a proper 3D ultrasonography. MRI, we are less likely to use MRI, but in certain cases where we are suspecting congenital abnormalities, certain tumors which are invading, or endometriosis, we may have to use MRI as a diagnostic modality sometimes. On 3D ultrasonography, we can pick up important things, especially nowadays. The role of 3D ultrasonography is coming up in adenomyosis, where the junctional zone abnormalities can be very well detected on this 3D ultrasonography picture. And the role of that in diagnosing adenomyosis. We have hysteroscopy as a diagnostic modality. So nowadays, routine hysteroscopy for IVF, no always. So we have had a panel last week in ISAR where we discussed about routine hysteroscopy for IVF. Definitely no, but a hysteroscopy for recurrent implantation failure will be a definitely yes. And multiple studies have shown that the pathologies which were not diagnosed initially on ultrasonography, missed on a 2D ultrasonography, or sometimes on a 3D ultrasonography, can be very well picked up, and a see and treat principle can be followed. So in the same setting, you can treat that. So we have certain diagnoses such as small polyps, subseptate uterus. Of course, this can be diagnosed nowadays with good 3D scans. We have intrauterine adhesions and submucous myomas, which can be diagnosed on hysteroscopy and can be treated in the same setting. Routine, if you're using office hysteroscopy, again, that's recommended nowadays as a diagnostic modality. So screening for congenital and acquired thrombophilic conditions is also recommended. So we have this congenital, which the commonest is the factor V laden mutation. Karyotyping analysis for the couple. So as we have seen, the karyotyping is important for detecting the balanced translocations, inversions, which can be seen, and balanced translocations can be correspondingly correlated with RIF cases. In cases of unexplained infertility, we are using a laparoscopy, but another important role of laparoscopy in ART practices is in the cases of recurrent implantation failure. Small hydrosalpinges, adhesions, and endometriosis, which can cause, also some cases of adenomyosis, can cause poorly receptive endometrium sometimes, and this can be helped by using a laparoscopy. And again, a see and treat principle in laparoscopy can be followed, where we can treat the hydrosalpinges by clipping. We can treat mild to moderate cases of endometriosis. They are better treated than expectant management. So these are the certain things which we can do by using a laparoscopy. Endometrial biopsy again forms an important aspect of treating cases of recurrent implantation failure. Previously, we used to do endometrial dating by Noyes criteria. Nowadays, what we are doing is the CD138 for detecting cases of chronic endometritis, and we are doing the endometrial receptivity array, or detecting the exact window of implantation which we want, and doing a personalized or embryo transfer or PET. Immunological testing for natural killer cells, both the central and the peripheral natural killer cells, can help in some cases, and we can be helpful for guiding some treatments such as steroids or use of immunosuppressive agents. We have a raised Th1 to Th2 ratio can again be dealt with. However, laparoscopy, endometrial biopsy, and immunological testing has got a weaker evidence, and their role is sometimes can be controversial. So we have to take a decision based on the current clinical scenario. Endocrine workup is must. So we have hyperthyroidism and hypothyroidism, both the extremes which can cause infertility or subfertility. We have cases of diabetes mellitus again can again cause some free occipital damage in both the male and the female partners. So the gamete can be at a problem, the embryo can be at a problem, and again the implantation is affected by diabetes mellitus. So we have hyperprolactinemia again as an independent entity which can affect fertility. So all this comes in the endocrine workup. Detection of autoantibodies, as we have seen right now, the anticardiolipin antibody forms the important part of detection, and which can cause recurrent implantation failure. We'll shortly discuss some cases so that we can plan treatment for our patients. So there's this case, Mrs. Eleman, 28 years old, married since 5 years, regular cycles. Her AMH was 1.8 and antral follicle count slightly on lower side, 8 to 9. Husband was azoospermic with normal FSH and LH, so there was an obstructive factor to the azoospermia. As it was OA or obstructive azoospermia, we were planning to use the testicular sperm aspiration as a method for sperm retrieval in this patient, and antioxidants were planned 3 months prior to IVF or ICSI. In the first visit, the ultrasonography showed normal with the endometrial thickness normal, the subendometrial blood flow was also normal. 5 millimeter polyp was done, so therefore polypectomy was also done. So everything was done, and the patient was prepared for IVF and ICSI. So their plan was ICSI with PESA and ET. In IVF, antagonist protocol was used, dose of 225, subsequently increased to 300. Looking at the poor response again and the slow growth of follicles, the dose was increased to up to 450. That's the maximum dose which we can use. So 7 oocytes were retrieved, 4 were fertilized by sperms from PESA, and we could see on day 5 only 2 reached the early compaction stage, and there was no blastocyst formation. So it was a failure to blastocyst formation. So this is one thing which goes, this case goes in more so of a recurrent IVF failure till now. So ET was done on day 5 by single blastocyst, a single blastocyst was retrieved. So implantation failure in this case, where the embryo quality was poor, a single blastocyst was transferred. Was it due to poor oocyte quality? Was it due to a poor sperm quality? So as we have seen that what are the causes of causes which affect the oocyte and sperm quality? What are the reasons for fragmentation which we see in the embryo, and how oxygen radicals can affect the oocyte and the sperms? So pathological effects of ROS on sperm function, we have given antioxidants, but what are the probable effects? It inhibits the sperm function and viability due to peroxidation of membrane, loss of membrane fluidity required for sperm adhesion, and it reduces the ATP and sperm kinetics. It also initiates the apoptosis, this reactive oxygen species. Similarly, the ROS can also affect the female reproduction. It can directly damage the oocytes. It can cause impaired fertilization by IVF or ICSI. Embryo developmental arrest can occur. Embryo fragmentation can occur due to early setting in of apoptosis. Implantation failure, abortion, and congenital anomalies can occur in the offspring. We can have a luteal phase defect coming up due to this ROS. And it's also indicated in other cause in entities such as endometriosis, hydrosalpinx, and PCOD, unexplained infertility, where this ROS species will be raised. So if we consider ROS and sperm DNA damage, so majority of the studies have proven that ROS can cause a damage to the sperms and interfere with fertility by natural conception and also along with ICSI. So 1 gram vitamin C and vitamin E daily were given in this patient as an antioxidant, and the outcomes were analyzed, and it was shown that the outcomes were improved after use of antioxidants. And nowadays we all know that oral antioxidant therapy is the recommended therapy for male factor due to ROS. So oral antioxidant therapy appears to improve ICSI outcomes in those patients with sperm DNA damage in whom this treatment reduces the percentage of damaged spermatozoa. So we should not be hurrying up with cases of IVF. So to prevent the implantation failure, a proper adjuvant therapy is also necessary. So as we have seen adjuvant therapy in males, we have adjuvant therapy, lifestyle modification therapy in the females also, which is very, very important. So before rushing in for a next IVF for such case where we had a negative beta HCG, we should ensure lifestyle modifications such as smoking cessation, reduce alcohol consumption, restore a normal BMI or a healthy BMI less than at least 25, a good exercise and a good mental health and a stress reduction should be advised. So in this case, we have seen that the husband was already on antioxidant therapy. However, the female did not receive any antioxidant therapy. So later on, the female was also put on antioxidant therapy and a cycle was planned to her later on. Subsequently, after the in this patient, just complete this patient's history. So this patient received a minimal ovarian dose stimulation protocol, which we follow. It is a 150 international units of RFSH or HMG. Both can be used in an antagonist cycle, and antagonist is started once the follicle size is more than or equal to 12 millimeters. That is a variable dose protocol of starting antagonist. And after this, we could see that the 7 oocytes were reduced, out of which 6 were M2. And all the 6 were fertilized, and 4 embryos were of good quality, which could be vitrified, and 2 embryos where you can see a very good 2 embryos on day 5 blastocyst, which were transferred. And this patient then came to be having a beta HCG positive. And so we should not forget our basics. We should be starting the lifestyle measurements, that adjuvant treatment before rushing in for infertility treatment in implantation failure cases. So oral antioxidants have a role in female infertility as well, and especially in such kind of patients, the proper the time duration where the oogenesis will take place is roughly around 2 to 3 months. So that is the time period where all these medications, adjuvant medications, should be used, and then the patient should be subjected to recurrent implantation to IVF or ICSI. Cases where we can use poor ovarian reserve, where we can use DHEA in a dose of 75 milligram daily. Uh, Another antioxidants and agents which can be used are N-acetylcysteine, astaxanthin, coenzyme Q. All this have shown effect. We have multiple studies with DHEA and poor ovarian reserve. Certain conflicting studies are now coming up regarding the role of DHEA. However, for poor ovarian reserve, DHEA forms a very good drug which can be used as an adjuvant to improve the oocyte quality. We have use of testosterone or androgens, which can be used a month prior to starting stimulation in these patients. Also, we should not be forgetting about the pre-treatment. So this pre-treatment usually can be done by estrogen, where what we are following in a dose of 2 milligram twice daily, starting on the 21st day of the previous cycle, and then we are starting with the stimulation after withdrawal bleeding. The ovulation induction protocol is also important in patients to get very good results in cases of recurrent implantation failure. So a study was done, a retrospective study to investigate the relationship between pregnancy rates and the protocol used during IVF. And as much as 854 cycles were evaluated by Tamir et al. And it was shown that the, uh, the pregnancy rate significantly increased in those who had this ovarian stimulation with optimum dose, not too high, not too low. Combining estrogen and progesterone with luteal support again helped in uh, as compared to progesterone only. This was shown in the study. There was no difference in pregnancy rates between the groups stimulated by recombinant or urinary, and both of these drugs were considered as equally effective. There is no added value of HCG in the use of in the luteal support. there was some help and evidence to suggest addition of LH, recombinant LH to FSH in cases of poor responders. So this is what we can follow. We can, there's a possible benefit, and therefore this benefit is also seen in women more than 35 years of age. We can use this ultra long protocol in patients of endometriosis and adenomyosis, where the suppression by GnRH agonist will help in resulting in a better oocyte quality and better pregnancy rates. This was shown by Salam et al. And Russell et al. In 2011. Growth hormone is another enigmatic thing which can be used along with routine stimulation. Growth hormone can be used, may lead to a good embryo quality, and high concentration in the follicular fluid increases the oocyte quality and gives a better oocyte yield implantation, better oocyte yield, better fertilization rates, and consequently better pregnancy rates. Changing the protocol is sometimes beneficial. So too high dose may be detrimental. We have seen in the study by Wegener et al. That a very high dose can be detrimental. So we should do a capping of dose for each of the poor responders, normal responders, and hyper responders. In poor responders, sometimes minimal stimulation and dual stim protocol can work very well, and we can use these protocols to get a good oocyte yield whenever they are not given by a conventional antagonist protocol or a long agonist protocol. Embryo rate is the limiting step in human reproduction. So we have the embryo quality, the number transferred, the stage of development, and the storage protocol. All these will be affecting the success of your IVF. So very good lab practices and standardizing all these practices is very important. Now we have a question here: is morphological grading sufficient? So sometimes we have a very good looking embryo of 4AA, 5AA grading embryo which doesn't implant. So sometimes we can get clues from time-lapse imaging or certain other techniques where we have a better embryo selection process. So we have artificial intelligence coming up nowadays, which can be amalgamated with the computer-assisted systems to for sperm selection, for embryo selection as well. So these are the future of embryo selection. Regarding improving the embryo quality, we have all these techniques. Each of these is very important, and some of these have been validated and recommended. So we all know that blastocyst transfer has yielded better results than cleavage stage transfer. So this is, yes, a high quality recommendation for blastocyst transfer. Assisted hatching, especially nowadays, we have all using lasers. So assisted hatching, we are all, majority of the cycles are frozen embryo transfer cycles, and assisted hatching forms an important aspect of frozen throat transfers in these frozen embryos. As we all know that there's a little bit of zona hardening which takes place, and which way assisted hatching will help this. Then a sequential transfer is being studied in certain studies, where we have a day 3 transfer and again a day 5 transfer or a blastocyst transfer. So this sequential transfer can sometimes be used to get better results. But as you all know that the number of embryos transferred will be more in the sequential transfer, and there is a risk of multiple pregnancies, and also there is a risk of dislodging the previous embryo. However, this risk is considered theoretical, but the risk still exists. We have certain technologies like the we'll be talking about IMSI later on when we are discussing about the sperm selection techniques. But we have certain techniques called as the IVM as an alternative to IVF. So sometimes we have cases of IVF failure. However, this is not related to RIF cases. This is IVF failure due to poor oocyte quality. So that if the oocyte doesn't mature enough, and we have failure of growth of the oocytes, can we mature the oocytes outside the body very well? So that is called as in vitro maturation, and it has yielded good results, especially in those cases of poor ovarian reserve or suboptimal response to stimulation, where we can remove ideally a pure IVM cycle would be without giving a trigger, but modified IVM cycles are where we can give a HCG trigger and then remove the oocytes and go for a in vitro maturation outside. We have certain substances which will favor and be useful for this oocyte maturation, which will be helpful to get M2 oocytes. Also, IVM can be used in patients of PCOS where we are expecting a hyper response. We have both the ovaries which are showing more than 25, 30 follicles, and we don't want a hyperstimulation. We also don't want to cancel cycle. I know that we are in an era of freezing all the eggs and the embryos, and also in the era of agonist trigger, but still a certain degree of risk can remain for OHSS, and this can be very well decreased by going a partial pickup for IVM, and then in the other ovary you can go for a regular IVF and a trigger. So this is a policy which is variable, again can be used for different kinds of people. Co-culture system. So we have certain co-cultures which are coming up, especially the cumulus cell culture. So we have it has been shown that naturally when the oocyte is in along with the cumulus cells, the sperm it goes in the tube along with certain amount of cumulus cells, and this has helped in the fertilization process and later on subsequently in the implantation process. So if we have a co-culture system with cumulus cells, this might help in resulting in a better embryo quality and subsequently a better pregnancy and a live birth rate. So all these things are being tried. So this is not being validated and justified in large multicentric studies. We have the role of PGT-A and PGT-M along with PGT-SR. So where we are getting balanced translocations, PGT-SR is definitely recommended. For PGT-A, there are multiple studies which are favoring PGT-A in RIF cases, which shows a diagnosis of aneuploid embryos, and a better euploid embryo can give a better success rate. However, recent data have yielded conflicting results and again created a controversy regarding a routine use of PGT-A for all cases of RIF. So again, this pre-implantation genetic testing for aneuploidy or PGT-A should be used on an individualized basis for each patient. So we have genetic factors which can be dealt very well with PGT-A. Again, a male factor in the lab can be dealt with certain procedures called as the IMSI or morphological selection of the very good sperm, where we have a very high magnification of the sperms, around 6,000x, and then we select a morphologically good sperm for ICSI, and this has been shown to yield better results than routine ICSI cases. We have use of PIXI as a sperm selection methodology. We have magnetic assorted cell sorting. We have microfluidics. All these have shown to yield a better morphologically normal sperm. Also, MAX has shown to give a better sperm with a better DNA integrity. So again, those patients who have raised DFI, we have certain techniques like MAX, we have certain techniques like TISA, where we can do the sperm selection or the sperm retrieval with these techniques, and this can yield a better result in a cases of recurrent implantation failure. Regarding the role of PGT-A, so PGT-A has been extensively studied. So PGT-A with fish was studied in this study by and the Coulomb et al., where we have studied the advanced maternal age and cases of RIF and the use of PGT-A. It was shown that advanced maternal age, there was a statistically significant difference between the implantation rate and the pregnancy rate, as against in the recurrent implantation failure study RIF group, there were no significant differences observed between those who were subjected to PGT and those who were not subjected to PGT. So PGS or PGT-A does not increase the probability of a successful pregnancy, except in women of more than 40 years, where it can be a indicated thing. Patients of RIF or recurrent pregnancy losses, where we have more than 3 IVF failures, where we have more than 2 recurrent pregnancy losses, this can be again used as an individualized treatment, and proper counseling for PGT-A has to be done. If it comes to euploid, then what? And if it comes to be an aneuploid, there is something called as a gray zone in this, where you can get a report of mosaicism So again, what to do about this mosaic embryos is again a dilemma. So all this has to be counseled to the patient before we go in and venture for PGTA as a treatment for recurrent implantation failure. So we have ASRM guidelines from 2007, which does not support the routine use of PGS or PGTA for RIF cases. So we can take home the selected cases we can do PGTA. Blastocyst culture, so cleavage stage embryo culture and blastocyst culture, we have definitely blastocyst culture will be useful in patients who are younger and have more than 6 oocytes. They'll definitely go to the blastocyst stage and yield better success rate, as we all know that natures will select the best quality embryo after 5 days of culture. A study by Papanicolaou et al. In 2008, which is a systematic review and meta-analysis, it showed that there was a significantly higher live birth rate after blastocyst culture as against the cleavage stage embryo transfer. So this is now a standard norm which is accepted. Regarding thinning or drilling, so do we thin the zona or we drill it? Again, confusion. So we have this video which will nicely show you about the laser assisted hatching or thinning of the zona. So partial hatching or complete hatching, again depends, but we have pros and cons of each of these technique. We have you can see the laser being used here. So this is a sequential hatching which was done in a cleavage stage embryo, where a laser can be used on the day 3 and later on the hatching can be assessed on day 5. This has got its own advantages and disadvantages. So a too small hole in the blastomere might result in a trapped blastocyst and lysis of and too big hole can cause lysis of blastomeres and sometimes can cause difficulties in culture to the blastocyst stage. So a thinning of around 25% circumference is advisable. Which embryo should benefit? So we have cases of RIF where it can be used, cases of frozen thyroid embryos where we have a thick zona more than 15 micrometers, old age patients, poor oocyte quality where we have cases of endometriosis, PCOD patients which can have some amount of thick zona. This can benefit with assisted hatching. So Cochrane and ASRM all have justified use of assisted hatching. So there was a Cochrane which said that increased pregnancy rate were seen in cases of RIF. ASRM committee opinion also said that it improves clinical pregnancy rates in poor prognosis patients, especially in those cases of RIF. Regarding the use of embryo glue, we have embryo glue which can be used, which is a hyaluron enriched embryo transfer medium. Evidence suggests that there is an improved clinical pregnancy rates and live birth rate with the use of embryo glue. There are certain conflicting results as well, but this is a Cochrane from 2015, which I am quoting. So in some cases where you have RIS, especially, you can use hyaluron enriched embryo transfer medium or the embryo glue. So before we proceed, we'll see about the sperm as a cause of recurrent implantation failure. So we have DNA fragmentation indices, the sperm chromatin structure assay, sperm chromatin dispersion test, and DNA fragmentation more than 27%. Some guidelines say it as 30% as a cause for RIF. So the practice committee of ASRM recommends DNA, says that the DNA testing alone, it cannot predict the outcome, but some cases there is definitely a role of DFI testing where you have RIF. So it is measured as 100 into the fragmented plus degraded sperms upon the number of sperms observed. And if this is more than 30 as a cutoff, most of the studies had an adverse impact on the embryo quality both in IVF and ICSI. So DNA fragmentation usually tells you about the double strand DNA breaks, and this is usually related to a lack of DNA repair which takes place in the meiosis and linked with a higher rate of miscarriage, low embryo quality, and a higher risk of implantation failure. So what is the treatment for raised DFI? It can be due to as we have seen, due to the ROS, and we have adjuvant therapy of more than 84 days, which is the period for spermatogenesis, which should be practiced. So antioxidant for around 3 months and a testicular sperm aspiration can seem as an effective option in such patients where we have raised DFI in spite of use of the antioxidant therapy. MC is again a real-time method where sperm is selected before the micro-injection. Magnification is done, and as spermatozoa devoid of surface vacuoles are identified and selected. So there is a 6000x magnification which is done, and all these facilities are available in good quality for IVF labs. So the only confirmed indication of MC today is RIF cases. So we should not miss MC as a therapeutic thing or as a treatment for RIF. We'll shortly go on to further cases. So 33-year-old sub-secondary subfertility with one live child. I'll shortly tell you the diagnosis. It was poor quality of endometrium causing RIF. So how do we define thin endometrium? Is vascularity important? Is there some entity called as resistant endometrium? And how do we prepare endometrium for optimal implantation? So all these things are to be answered. So what is optimum endometrium? So majority of the studies say that 8 to 13 millimeters of endometrium is considered as an optimum endometrium. Some studies have shown that endometrium up to 15 millimeter can be considered as an optimal endometrium. Later on, more than that will negatively impact the implantation rates. Regarding the vascularity, we have the 4 zones where we have to see for the vascularity. So we have zone 1 to zone 4. Zone 1 being the outermost and the zone 4 being the innermost. So usually the vascularity should be somewhere between the zone 3 and zone 4. We have something called as a resistant endometrium, where in spite of using all methods to improve the endometrial thickness, its architecture and its vascularity, we don't yield a proper endometrium. So we are going to discuss about a better endometrium, how to prepare a better endometrium for implantation in cases of RIF. So is all this going to help? Is there any role of aspirin therapy, sildenafil, routine endometrial scratching, high dose estrogen, and GCSF? So endometrial scratching before IVF. So routinely in multiple meta-analysis and studies, it has been shown that endometrial scratching routinely before IVF will not help. In women with RIF, inducing local injury to the endometrium has shown some positive results, especially in a study by Poddar et al., which was a systematic review and meta-analysis. This endometrial injury was performed between day 7 of previous cycle and day 7 of the embryo transfer cycle, which can result in higher chances of implantation and higher live birth rate and clinical pregnancy rates. However, Cochrane in 2015 doesn't recommend endometrial scratch as a technique for routine use in IVF or in cases of RIF. Refractory endometrium is where the endometrial thickness remains less and it is difficult or impossible to make it grow more than 7 millimeters. So endometrial thickness less than 7 millimeters is usually considered as detrimental for the success of IVF. And the causes for this can be surgical dilatation and curettage, post procedures like submucous myoma resection, abdominal laparoscopic myomectomy or abdominal myomectomy where the cavity is open, a prostplasmon, and patients who had underwent radiotherapy. Infections, sometimes chronic endometritis can lead. Sometimes Mullerian anomalies like subseptate uterus can manifest as a thin endometrium. Other infections like coughs can cause a resistant endometrium, and sometimes idiopathic causes can also be there. So USG assessment of endometrial receptivity can be done by measurement of its thickness, the echogenicity and architecture, and Doppler assessment of the uterine and the spiral arterial flow. This can sometimes be fallacious because sometimes pregnancies are seen in as low as 5 millimeter endometrium. So all the factors I think are very important when we consider optimum endometrium: the blood flow, the architectural pattern, that is the echogenicity, and the thickness combined will be very important rather than only the thickness. So here we can see the pregnancy rates in different ecogenicity or architectural patterns. So the left hand side, we can see a proper trilaminar pattern of endometrium, which shows a highest pregnancy rate of around 60%. And as the hyperechogenicity goes on increasing, we can see that the trilaminar pattern is lost and the pregnancy rates drop to less than 15%. Again, the hyperechogenicity is recommended by the amount of percentage of hyperechogenicity. So if it is more than 70% hyperechogenous endometrium, again, you will get a poor IVF outcome. So what is the optimum ET? So empirically, most initially prefer more than 7 millimeters. In most of the studies, it is 8, but 7 is what is the cutoff is most of the times taken. Success have been determined from 5 to 15. And a triple layer is associated with better success than a hyperechoic. So is hysteroscopy recommended for all? Definitely no, but in cases of RIF, we are discussing, RIF will, hysteroscopy will diagnose around 45% correctable pathology in cases of RIF, and therefore it is a recommended thing. We can diagnose polyps, adhesions, submucous fibroids grading from 0 to 2, and a chronic endometritis. Now, many of these things may be missed on a routine, very well done 3D ultrasonography as well. Therefore, see and treat principle, very good to go see inside the cavity, treat the cause, and come out and improve your IVF success. Hysteroscopic resection of septum also improves the reproductive outcome, said by multiple studies now. So, polyps in infertility, again, maybe a subcentimetric polyp or a polyp more than 1 centimeter, all have to be treated whenever you are dealing with RIF cases. In patients with incidental diagnosis of polyp or submucous fibroid less than 1 centimeter, it can be left alone. But in all those patients who are undergoing fertility treatment and who are undergoing IVF cycles, all these barriers in the endometrium should be removed. And hysteroscopy is a must for all patients of RI. Post hysteroscopy, estradiol valeriate in a dose of 6 to 8 milligram can be increased up to 16 milligram. And in the luteal phase, estrogen can also be used for support for such kind of patients. The role of GCSF in refractory endometrium. So we have two dicey things, that is GCSF and PRP. There are contradictory reports and there are no meta-analysis or multicentric RCTs about this. So GCSF supplementation has been shown to modulate the expression of genes which play an important role in implantation, adhesion, and immune regulation, was shown by Ramati et al. In 2014. So dose of around 300 micrograms subcutaneously, or you can instill it directly in the uterine cavity by a IUI catheter. And some studies have shown a benefit of this in refractory endometrium cases. Also, when you are giving GCSF on the same day, if you are withdrawing blood and collecting PRPs or the platelet-rich plasma from this, you will be yielding more amount of cell and more amount of this plasma platelets, which are considered as one form of stem cells where you can use in the refractory endometrium cases. So we usually in refractory endometrium cases, I personally administer 2 doses of GCSF. One can be given along with the PRP transfusion. If the endometrium is very poor, this can be repeated. The PRP and the GCSF both can be repeated. So we have this study by Glacier et al. Who had Norbert Glacier, who has a very high amount of literature on DHEA. He has also done this study on GCSF, and he has shown that uterine perfusion with GCSF presents a promising tool for refractory or inadequate or thin endometrium cases. Regarding the low dose of aspirin, so some studies in 2000 initially showed a higher pregnancy rate, but nowadays meta-analysis by Dentale et al. In 2012 did not support this and therefore failed to give as a aspirin, a low dose aspirin as a guideline for using in thin endometrium cases. Therefore, right now its use for thin endometrium cases is not supported. Regarding the use of sildenafil nitrate, as we all know, it is a nitric oxide releaser, phosphodiesterase inhibitor. It used in a dose of 25 milligram 3 times a day or 4 times a day. It will it will release a nitric oxide by reducing the cyclic GMP degradation. and has been useful in some cases of refractory endometrium. I have already told about my experience of PRP, and there are many studies which favor and which go against PRP. So outcome of this case was that this patient, who was a case of recurrent implantation failure with thin endometrium, was a case of ANA positive. So we all were thinking about only thin endometrium hysteroscopy and adjuvant treatment for it, but the cause of thin endometrium can sometimes be systemic, and it can be a thrombophilia, it can be auto antibodies like ANA positivity. So this was detected. Office hysteroscopy followed by vasodilator therapy was initiated, and estrogen priming was done along with a low molecular weight heparin, which will very well antagonize some of these antibodies, and locally help was started, and excellent vascularity was later on seen on Doppler. So all these things were used, and right now the patient is around 36 weeks ANC. Another important thing which will be considered along with the poor endometrium cases is the chronic endometritis. So we have cases of chronic endometritis where the diagnosis is again an enigma. It cannot be detected on routine diagnostic and imaging testing. Therefore, a hysteroscopy has to be done. And we have Cicinelli et al. Classification of chronic endometritis on hysteroscopy, where the triad of hyperemia, stromal edema, and micropolyps can be seen. And this triad is definitely helpful for a diagnosis of endometritis. And definitely antibiotics can be given as per the culture, or if no growth grows, the antibiotic can be used. So another test which is coming up as an alternative is the uterine microbiome testing, or the EMMA test. This is the endometrial microbiome metagenomic analysis. So all these omics, genomics are coming up, and this EMMA test is again an important test which can detect unbalanced endometrial flora, which can be associated with poorer IVF outcome. So this can again form an important test of detecting poor endometrial receptivity in some cases. So treatment of this chronic endometritis will be antibiotics, either systemic or intrauterine, and the use of probiotics such as lactobacillus. So there are some studies which are coming up regarding the use of lactobacillus in chronic endometritis cases with positive results. So if the culture shows presence of Enterococcus and Streptococcus agalacti, we can use 1 gram of amoxicillin clavulanate twice daily for 8 days. E. coli, you can use ciprofloxacin for 10 days. And mycoplasma, ureaplasma, you can use josamicin 1 gram for 12 days. In case of refractory patients, you can use minocycline 100 milligram twice daily for 12 days. Suppose the cultures are negative and you you have not done a culture. In those cases, doxycycline with metronidazole, as we all know, the era long antibiotics being used since ages for PID can again be used here for 14 days as a treatment for chronic endometritis. So what is the effectivity of this treatment? It will improve the clinical pregnancy rate as high as 65% and also the live birth rate. This was shown in the study by Cicinelli et al. In 2015. Another important thing which needs to be discussed about endometrium is the ERA, or the endometrial receptivity array. So 1 in 4 females has a displaced window of implantation. So around 25% of females will have a displaced window of implantation, and we'll have to find out this WOI, or window of implantation, and plan the personalized embryo transfer accordingly. So what is ERA? ERA was developed as an objective molecular dating method. As we all know that the endometrial dating was done by using Noyes criteria initially, where it was subjective classification of the endometrium. However, now we have ERA where we do a profiling of 238 genes which are expressed at different stages of endometrial cycle, and this will guide us whether the endometrium is pre-receptive, receptive, or post-receptive. So now, when is this ERA done, and how does this ERA analyze things? So customized array of transcriptomic signature of 238 genes. It's linked to the computational predictor to give the results and to assess the window of implantation, or WI. It is more accurate than endometrial histology. So when is ERA incorporates taking an endometrial tissue biopsy sample on LH plus 7 days in a natural cycle, or progesterone plus 5 or T plus 5 in a HRT cycle. It's reproducible in the same patient and also for multiple menstrual cycle. A report usually comes as receptive, non-receptive, and non-receptive can be pre and post-receptive. So here, this is the ERA test. We have a pre-receptive, receptive, and post-receptive endometrium. How do we plan our transfer? So in the lower picture, you can see if we are planning a day 3 transfer, when we have to plan. If we are planning a day 5 transfer, if the patient is receptive, the ERA is done accordingly. And if the patient is post-receptive, the transfer is done at P+7. So the patient continues to take progesterone according to the treatment protocol till the transfer is done, and then later on post-transfer also for luteal phase support. So we have another important thing is the causing recurrent implantation failure is endometriosis affecting. So there was a patient who underwent IVF with along with this endometrioma, which was not removed, and then presented with a 5/6 endometrioma. What would be the next line of treatment? Whether laparoscopy or would you change the IVF-ICSI protocol? I think clearance of endometriosis in such a large endometrioma has been shown to be effective, and laparoscopy is a gold standard. So study by Dunselman et al. In 2014, which is also a nice guideline recommendation, grade B, that operative laparoscopy should be considered instead of expected management to increase spontaneous pregnancy cases in endometriosis, and also it will help in cases of IVF and ICSI. But the subsequent or repetitive surgery for endometriosis doesn't have any improved outcomes. So grade 1 and 2 endometriosis definitely useful. Grade 3 and 4 endometriosis, it doesn't help much. Also, you have to change the protocol to ultra long protocol in cases of endometriosis. Now, this is a case of a fibroid with dilated saculations of the tubules, but the tubes are open right now, and a subsequent finding showed that the fibroid was increased. The IVF initially it was not indenting myoma, and it was intramural purely, so myomectomy was not planned. Later on, it showed that the intramural myoma was indenting the cavity, and the size was about 5 centimeter. So regarding leiomyoma and implantation success, a number of acquired intracavity uterine pathologies, including submucous fibroid, polyps, and intrauterine adhesions, as we know, contribute for RIF cases. Fibroids, submucous fibroids definitely will affect fertility by adversely affecting implantation, including the increased uterine contractility, deranged cytokine profile, abnormal vascularization, and chronic endometrial inflammation. Usually, these are not missed most of the times by a good 3D ultrasonography and a 2D ultrasonography, where you can see a hypoechoic structure seen on near the endometrium. However, small endometrial submucous myomas can be missed and can be a factor for recurrent implantation failure. Also, evidence suggests that serous leiomyomas and intramural myomas less than 4 centimeter not nearing indenting the cavity will not impact the IVF outcome. But intramural myomas more than 4 centimeters are associated with reduced pregnancy rates, as one shown by Olvera et al. In 2004. So how do all these mechanical factors like adenomyosis and fibroids affect? Is that the HOX-A gene expression is reduced in those cases of submucous myoma or intramural myomas who are indenting the endometrial cavity, as seen in the upper left corner picture here. And in those who have been treated, or those who have normal endometrial cavity, have a good HOX-A expression. So this is a genetic explanation for this. And therefore, submucous myoma also will be resected. Fibroids nearing the cavity and indenting the endometrium should be resected in cases of RIF before going ahead for the next transfer. So another implantation, last hypothetical scenario I have considered here is that all things are normal. There is a good embryo, a good vascular endometrium, and there is no systemic or local cause apparently. So in those cases, what cause might be there? So these are the cases which will trouble us more. Will you do hysteroscopy in each and every case of this type of patients of RIF? My answer is yes. We already discussed about hysteroscopy. What are the abnormal findings? Again, we have already discussed about submucous polyps, fibroids, adhesions, and chronic endometritis. So histoscopy, it has shown that the incidence of uterine anomalies was has around 40% in those who have not done histoscopy before and embryo transfer, and there was a RIF case in those patients. So other causes can be thrombophilias who have everything normal, and there can be problem with acquired or congenital thrombophilias. The treatment or modality of treatment for such kind of patients is low molecular weight, and aspirin here is an indicated treatment, and aspirin there where we saw thin endometrium, it was not an indicated treatment. Immunological causes where we have raised natural killer cells or a raised Th1 to Th2 ratio or other autoimmune antibodies sometimes can be helped by use of intralipids, intravenous immunoglobulins, and use of steroids. So immunological causes include the autoimmunity and alloimmunity. Autoimmunity attacks its own tissues. Alloimmunity is the foreign tissues, that is graft rejection, as we all know. So the cause can be SLE, rheumatoid arthritis, Hashimoto's thyroiditis. It can be secondary or reactionary to endometriosis, and there can be idiopathic reasons as well. So these are the list of investigations or diseases which will impact adversely the implantation process and cause recurrent implantation failure. The immunological cause of RIF. So antiphospholipid antibody syndrome and other antiphospholipid antibodies, thyroid autoimmunity, celiac disease, peripheral natural killer cells and uterine natural killer cells, maternal KIR and HLA-C haplotype, again Th1 and Th2 raised ratio, and endometrial pro-inflammatory cytokine profile. So out of these, the antiphospholipid antibody and the thyroid antibody have a higher strength of recommendation than the others. What is the treatment of these immunological causes? So we can use heparinoids, enhance phospholipid production by trophoblast. They repel the antiphospholipid antibody production from trophoblast and acts as an antithromboplastin. Decreased platelet adhesiness is also seen. You can use intralipids as a suppressor of natural killer cells. Intravenous immunoglobulins are expensive and they are not validated in many studies, associated with certain risks. Personally, I am not using IVIG to that extent. Dexamethasone and prednisolone can be used in those patients who have documented high levels of natural killer cells with no other factor, and it can be used till around 14 days after embryo transfer. Other therapies such as LIT, Humira, and aspirins are again being studied. Regarding the use of intralipids, this can be an important treatment for RIF cases. So intralipid is a fat emulsion which was supposed to be used for parenteral nutrition initially. Now has been also be used in cases of abnormal natural killer cell toxicity, cytotoxic activity, and raised peripheral natural killer cells. So it is composed of 10% soybean oil, egg yolk, phospholipids, and it can be used in a dose of 6.7 ml per kg of intralipid. And it has to be administered very slowly. The drip rate is around 2 to 3 ml per minute for intralipid administration. So you can have an infusion pump or a micro drip in place whenever you are using intralipid. And the patient has to be observed while you are using the intralipid. So this has to be given in your own setup. So it can be administered 7 to 14 days prior to ET, repeated on the day of ET, and repeated again after the positive test. It can be administered weekly until the 20th week. So different protocols can be used. A single dose or a multiple dose protocols can be used, but this is routinely what done about intralipids. Regarding IVIG, the only properly conducted RCT by Stephenson showed no benefit of IVIG, not going into the details of it. Again, there is no routine use of benefit of steroids in routine IVF cases, but as we discussed about raised NK cells and higher NK cell toxicity, cytotoxicity, we can use steroids. Empiric treatment with all this can benefit. So we have seen about intralipids. We can use tacrolimus as an immunosuppressive drug currently approved for immunological allograft rejection. So women with elevated ratios with tacrolimus achieved a 45% higher success rate in pregnancy as shown by Nakagawa et al. Also, peripheral blood mononuclear cells. So injection via intrauterine insemination catheter before embryo transfer is thought to improve pregnancy rates in RIF cases. Has been validated by certain studies, but again, there is no RCT recommending this use. GCSF can also be used as an adjuvant treatment in all these cases where everything is failed. We don't have any obvious cause of RIF. Intrauterine corrections by hysteroscopy we have seen. Empiric use of aspirin will not benefit, however, it will benefit in cases of thrombophilias. Empiric use of LMWH again is not justifiable. Luteal phase GnRH agonist as a case of RIF is being tried. So a decapeptyl or leupride, which we are using as a GnRH agonist as a trigger, 0.1 milligram can be used after 6 days of oocyte retrieval and can be used for luteal phase support as well as in cases of RIF. Certain studies have shown a benefit. However, this is not a recommendation. Lastly, to mention about the importance of treating hydrosulfingase. So we are all shown that LIF is the factor which is decreased by the presence of hydrosulfines. So the reflux will result in a mechanical and biochemical abnormalities in implantation, and it will act as an embryotoxic agent. So we have laparoscopic salpingectomy or proximal tubal occlusion in cases where salpingectomy is not achievable, or sometimes corneal coagulation, bilateral corneal coagulation by hysteroscopy can be achieved if there are severe adhesions. So improved pregnancy rates are seen, especially in cases of RIF where it was a missed hydrosulfines as a cause. So to summarize, these two slides are very important for all those who have missed the lecture till now or some part of it. So RIF, we have 3 dimensions. One is the embryo. Embryo will include the oocyte, sperm, and the embryo. Oocyte will include the adjuvant treatment for oocyte, improvement in oocyte quality and number, and change in protocol. Adjuvant treatments by antioxidants, DHEA, and androgens, especially in cases of poor result, patients we have seen myoinositol sometimes and metformin for cases of PCOD can be used. However, it is not supposed to improve the quality, but the oocyte retrieved and the risk of OHSS decreases. The protocol again is very important. So too high dose can damage some oocytes, and optimum oocyte collection protocol should be followed. A change in protocol can sometimes help. Regarding the sperms as a factor for RIF, we have to check for DNA fragmentation and karyotyping in both the husband and the wife before we proceed in RIF cases, and subsequently sperm selection techniques can be used to get a very good or better sperm for ICSI. Surgical treatment is indicated for cases of varicocelectomy. Infection treatment is indicated where you are getting semen cultures which are positive. Regarding embryo as a whole, you have to have a proper embryo selection technique. So a morphological assessment can sometimes be suboptimal. So you may have to adopt for certain computer-based systems like time-lapse imaging or artificial intelligence, which will be the future. Laser-assisted hatching and blastocyst, frozen embryo transfers are the important aspect of treatment of all IVF cases I see, but especially in RIF, this will benefit. Another dimension is the endometrium. So thin ET cases, we have treatment by hysteroscopy. We have resistant endometrium, which can be treated by the PRP, GCSF, and certain other medications which we have discussed. Endometrial receptivity can be improved by doing a ERA and a personalized embryo transfer. And sometimes endometrial receptivity can be improved by empirical treatment. We have seen use of GCSF, PRP to improve receptivity. So all these medications can also be used for improving the endometrial receptivity. Other factors which are there are the genetic, anatomical, pelvic, endocrine, infection, and immune. So genetic, we have seen the diagnosis can be done by karyotyping and PGTA, and subsequently euploid embryo can be transferred after PGTA or PGTA-SR. Anatomical defects, whether congenital or acquired, Submucous fibroids, polyps have to be treated. Intrauterine adhesions have to be treated by hysteroscopy before we proceed ahead. Pelvic pathologies such as adenomyosis, fibroids, and endometriosis, which are impairing with fertility and which are indicated to be treated, can be diagnosed by ultrasonography or a laparoscopy and treated in the same setting by laparoscopy. Adenomyosis and endometriosis can also be treated by use of GnRH agonists and use of certain other drugs. The protocol for stimulation has to be changed in such patients who are suffering from adenomyosis and endometriosis. The protocol for transfer has also to be changed. So we are usually giving a separation before transfer also. So a high dose or a leuprolide depot or a decapeptyl depot is administered before the embryo is transferred, so that the cytokine toxicity due to this adenomyosis and endometriosis doesn't impair with the implantation. Endocrine factors all have to be treated before we proceed ahead with implantation whenever we are dealing with RIF cases. Infection has to be ruled out, especially chronic endometritis, which cannot be seen without hysteroscopy. We have certain endometrial biopsy techniques now available with the use of CD138 molecule by immunohistochemistry, which can diagnose chronic endometritis. Antibiotic is a very easy treatment, but we have to diagnose it and treat it before we proceed ahead. Immune-related disorders form a very important group, which sometimes is difficult to diagnose, but there are multiple modalities which claim to be as a treatment for this sort of disorders. However, not much treatments are validated by systematic randomized trials. So this is in nutshell the treatment which we have seen. Anatomical causes can be treated by salpingectomy, fibroid removal, polypectomy, endometrial growth. Thrombophilias can be treated with LMWH and heparin. Genetics can be treated. There is genetic problem at the endometrial level by ERA, PGS or PGTA, karyotyping pattern maternal. Immunological causes can be treated with tacrolimus, intravenous immunoglobulin, peripheral blood mononucleosides, granulocyte colony stimulating factor. Infections can be treated with antibiotics, and altered molecules or endometrial receptivity can be studied. ERA test, personalized embryo transfer, endometrial scratch technique, and GCSF can help improve endometrial receptivity. Embryo level causes can be dealt with by PGTA, PGTSR, and PGD or PGTM. Male factors, IMSI and other sperm selection techniques can be used. And an optimal protocol for IVF stimulation, as we have seen for oocyte stimulation, can be used. So the take-home message for recurrent implantation failure and treatment is that the procedures which have proven benefit in treatment are the hysteroscopy procedure for all anatomical defects in the cavity, endometrial injury, especially in cases where there is case of thin endometrium, intrauterine administration of peripheral blood mononuclear cells, blastocyst transfer, assisted hatching, salpingectomy for tubal disease such as hydrosalpinx and tubal infections has all been shown to be a proven role, and others which are being tried and those who have probably have a role are aspirin, heparin, IVIG, intralipids, co-cultures with cumulus cells, sildenafil, transfer of more embryos, again a controversial topic, natural cycle IVF, and PGTA await further clinical assessment. So this is what is all about RIF for you. Thank you all for your patient hearing. Thank you very much.
So thank you, sir. Thank you for this excellent presentation. So you have shared a lot of new and upcoming data, and also
I'm so sorry for exceeding my time, but thank you all for staying back so long. And yes, Dr. Prachi.
Yes, thank you very much. So follow this, we have a question and answer session. So I'll quickly go to that. So before that, if you allow me, I have a couple of questions. So
Yes.
question number one is on sperm DNA fragmentation. So do you routinely advise this technique to all the couples which are coming to IVF centers, or only for the specific patient profiles? And the second question is about antioxidants, oral antioxidants, whether they are prescribed to all the patients, both male and female, or only in subgroups. So these are the two questions from my end.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Prachi, for those wonderful questions. First of all, I would like to thank Oasis Fertility, all administration, and Dr. Durga Rao for allowing me this talk on RIF. Also, I would like to thank Shield Healthcare for arranging this session for all the participants and taking me as a speaker. So, your question was regarding the DNA fragmentation index, the first question. So routinely DFI testing for all couples is not recommended if they are taking fertility treatment. Also, a routine DFI testing for all IVF cases we are not doing. We are subjecting to DFI testing only in those patients where we are expecting a DNA damage. Sometimes where there is severe OATs, or
Yes.
in those couples where what we are discussing about recurrent implantation failure, or those who have had a history of RPL, or a high paternal age. Again, this is a controversial area which I am entering. So high paternal age doesn't have an exact age which we can call it as high, but it has been shown by certain studies that
Okay.
paternal age more than 55 or 60 might affect a sperm adversely with regards to its DNA damage. So in certain this kind of patients, we can advise DFI testing. Your second question was
Right.
regarding the role of antioxidants for males and female infertility. So for male infertility, it's no harm in giving antioxidants because as a whole, if we consider, we are usually treating females in fertility treatment. The males usually don't have any
Correct,
say.
sir.
They are not
Right.
properly evaluated. They are not properly treated also. So proper semen analysis is very important. Treating the infections and giving antioxidants is must for those who have any of these like oligospermia, asthenospermia or teratospermia, but especially all those patients who are going for IVF therapy, I will routinely give antioxidant therapy even if he is a normospermic male. For females, as we have seen in a case where it was an implantation failure, so why wait for implantation failure and then give antioxidants?
Right,
So
sir.
as we know that ROS is going to cause problems in both males and females. We didn't discuss about vitamin D, but again, I am going to do about vitamin D levels in certain kind of patients of, especially of RIF or those who have other vitamin deficiencies, and also give vitamin D to such couples because this also has a very great role in establishing a good function in the ovary and the sperms. So yes, for both, this will give antioxidants.
Right, sir. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for your kind answers and also kind words regarding Shield Healthcare. So the next question is from Dr. Karthik. The question is, the patient is 30 years old, 2 blighted miscarriages, unexplained infertility later for 2 years. Parental
Okay.
karyotyping is normal. Proceeded with IVF, 14 M2 oocytes, but only 4 blastocysts. Breast fragmented at cleavage stage. 2 transfers failed, and patient has posterior adenomyosis. So how to proceed?
Okay. How many were the embryos transferred?
2 transfer, and I guess there are 4 blastocysts. That's how. So I guess two at one setting. That's my
Okay, okay. So basically, we have to see about the embryo quality factor of it because the oocyte and sperm quality can add the task where we can have a poor oocyte quality and poor sperm quality yielding low number of embryos. So we have seen that the oocyte yield was a little bit higher, but we couldn't get optimal number of embryos. So this is called as fertilization rate of the embryos. So if the fertilization rate is poor, there can be a fault in the gametes. Also, we are looking at recurrent pregnancy losses in the form of blighted ovums. So this patient needs proper counseling regarding maybe a probably poor oocyte or a gamete quality, which sometimes we can start adjuvant treatments for all of these. We can uh, evaluate the DNA fragmentation index in a male. We can think of uh, if we have a proper morphologically normal blastocyst, we can think of a PGTA before transferring in such a case where we had a history of RPL, where we had a fertilization failure. But the problem is that we should get good quality embryos. Sometimes such patients may not have gametes which are of good quality, and sometimes option of donor egg or donor sperm either ways may have to be tried in such kind of patients. So this is the last option. So that's my answer. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. The next question is again from Dr. Karthik. That patient had endometrial flow zone 3 in all cycles. Antagonist cycle with ICSI was done. So what could be the next option?
Okay, so this only same patient had blood flow at zone 3 in antagonist cycle. That's what I'm supposing. So the patient had adenomyosis. That's what posterior wall adenomyosis. That's what Dr. Karthik has mentioned. And adenomyosis at times can be a problem for implantation, as we have all seen. So I would recommend a transfer by using of a suppression by GnRH agonist, and then going for a transfer in this patient. Also, hysteroscopy before transfer and proper 3D ultrasonography to rule out hydrosalpinges in this patient is a must. But whatever diagnosis is like adenomyosis, we have to treat it before we go in for a transfer in such patient.
Right, sir. Thank you. The next question is from Dr. Vijaya Lakshmi. Should sildenafil be stopped before embryo transfer? And should dose of estradiol be reduced before embryo transfer?
Okay. So sildenafil we are not giving after embryo transfer. And estradiol we are continuing with the same dose, especially in those cases who had thin endometrium throughout the first trimester in our case. However, it's not been validated in much of the studies, but it's no point in removing estradiol immediately. So you can remove it, you can taper it off later on, but it doesn't cause any harm even after embryo transfer.
Thank you, sir. So next question is from Dr. Malti. Why luteal phase GnRH agonist is helpful in RIF, recurrent implantation failure?
Yes. So there is a small, we have a LH-like activity of GnRH agonist, if we see, with a shorter half-life. So we have to repeat it after every 3 days. And this LH-like activity will be helping in this luteal phase in those patients who have poor progesterone. And this is much more physiological than a use of HCG. So this is being tried, however, it's not being validated in number of studies, but some studies are coming up regarding the use of GnRH agonists in the luteal phase.
Right, sir. Thank you. So next question is, if the septal correction is done, then when can we do embryo transfer?
Okay. Usually, it is said that 2 months time is there required for complete healing to take place. So I guess 2 months is the time after which you can go for embryo transfer. Certain studies say that there is no much of difference between transfer immediately in the next month as against a 2 months transfer. But if it is a large septum, if it is a complete septum or a large subseptate uterus, you should wait for 2 months, and proper building of endometrium should be done with estradiol after you are dealing with the septum. You should also look for adhesions and reformation of septum on 3D ultrasonography before you proceed for embryo transfer in such patients.
Right, sir. Thank you. So the next question is the role of probiotics before embryo transfer and your experience.
Yeah. Routinely, I'm not giving probiotics as before embryo transfer or after embryo transfer. However, said this, patients who have had infections with long-standing PIDs or with RIF and chronic endometritis diagnosed, these patients may continue to receive probiotics throughout before their embryo transfer and after the embryo transfer as well. However, prolonged use may not be justifiable.
Right, sir. Thank you. So the next question is in hypo patient during ovulation induction. Should we add cetrorelix in IVF? And is there any role of routine antibiotics after ET, embryo transfer?
Okay. So there is no role of cetrorelix in such a patients. We are using high dose gonadotropins for this, and less likely that in hypo you will get LH surge. So yes, and routine use of antibiotics.
Yes, NAT, embryo transfer.
Not using routinely antibiotics. A proper aseptic technique should be followed, and if there is any infection, then only in such patients antibiotics can be considered.
Okay. And the last question is role of arginine in improving endometrial vascularity.
Many arginine, again, L-arginine is a nitric oxide releaser. So many studies are being evaluated, but there is no concrete guidance for the use of arginine. Personally, any of these can be used. All may not be used, like sildenafil, L-arginine, um, aspirin. This can be used. Any of these can be used as an empirical treatment. All of these don't have a standing in cases validated by RCTs.
Okay, right. So thank you. So one last question: how can we prepare PRP?
Yeah, so we are not preparing PRP here in our labs, but it's a easy process. You can do the centrifugation of whole blood and separate the plasma. By I'm not well versed how to prepare a PRP. I'm not doing it personally. We are sending it to a lab and then getting the PRP sample, the autologous PRP sample.
Right, sir. So those were the questions on our chat box. So thank you, sir. Thank you very much for your time, and
Thank you.
we are looking forward to your long-term association. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Prachi. Thank you, Shield Healthcare. Thank you all for your patient hearing.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your kind words.